Thanks for listening to Fluff and Crunch, where we talk about the connection and sometimes disconnect between system, setting, and story in tabletop RPGs. Oh, how you doing, Chris?
Yeah, good, thanks. You?
You sound tired. Is it because you're older now?
No, I'm fine.
You had a birthday this week, didn't you?
I did have a birthday this week.
Did have a birthday. I'm not going to ask how many years old you are. Is that supposed to represent the many times around the sun our Earth has gone
No, I
to
was just
reach your
trying to find.
birthday?
I was just going back to my previous images, trying to find one that would be like, okay,
Something that
best.
represents the topic for our day.
Yeah, I couldn't find anything like that, so I just
Mm.
gave up just randomly picking a
All
previous
right.
background.
So did you have a nice week? It looked like you went to some interesting places or did some fun stuff at least on the big special day.
Yeah, I went to Warhammer World, which is nice. They have a lot of good. They have like this exhibition thing with all these dioramas, which are pretty cool to look at,
Cool.
and
How
had some
far
nice
is that
food.
from you anyway?
About an hour,
Okay. Cool.
though not far.
Well, that's neat. Have you done it? Did you do any gaming last weekend? Any?
I've yeah, I met the guys twice. We played two more sessions of ISS Vanguard. So we had a whole big thing setting us off on the next part of which I guess is moving towards the end game now. Like after we'd got ambushed, our ship was like totally knackered, and we limped to the next planet where we met some people who then like gave us loads of technology and fixed our ship up. And so now we're sort of on the next part trying to find other people.
Cool.
And no one died on the most recent
Oh.
session, so that was a change. Normally we just wade through security, so that's going well. How about you?
Well, we played another session, another one-off of my the horror game that I'm developing because we're down a player, and so it I think it went pretty well. We actually ran an adventure from there's a series, and I did an episode on it a few months ago. There's a series of D100 based semi-system agnostic, but really actually chill first and second edition focused adventures called Fright Show Classics
Right.
that you can find on drive-through. And so I ran one of those using my rules, and it was a really investigation heavy story without a lot of there was only like combat at the very very end. There were some interactions and things like that, and that was cool. But I was really interested in seeing how the investigations and how the like social interactions mechanics worked, and they work pretty well. I need to do some work on combat. I need to do some work on creature stats. I'm not. It's tough actually. Creature stats that either aren't so fluffy that they're almost nothing versus creature stats that are so crunchy that it's just like a whole nother character and then some. I don't want either of those. So I got to go back to the drawing board a little bit on those two things. But otherwise, it went well. There are a lot of things about the game that I feel like I've nailed down, and so now I can work on those other things. Happy about that. Um, let's
Cool.
see. How do we transition and tell people to like and subscribe us?
As we can, it's always easier to do it at the end.
Telling people to like and subscribe at the end is easier, but from what I understand, it works better on the front end because you remind people, and those people listening right now, what I'm telling you are reminding you, you should like this. And if you don't
Yeah.
like it, you should give it a listen. And I think by the time you get into it, you will like it. And if you like it already, you should subscribe to it so you get reminded about it. And you should join our Discord and you should subscribe to the podcast. You should do all of those things.
Yeah. Tell your friends, write
Tell your
reviews,
friends.
tell everyone to nominate us for an Ennies for next year because it's too
That's
late this
right.
year.
That's right. That's right. And when you go back to school, if you haven't yet, you can talk about listening to this as something you did over the summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There we go.
Uh,
It's plenty of things.
your comment about how nobody died, all right, in your game, and something that happened in my game where the beastie did some mind control on one of the player characters and forced that character to attack the other characters represents our topic for today, or at least points toward it, and that topic is failure.
Failure.
Failure. Now, I took you to mean failure on the part of player
Yeah,
characters.
that's what I meant.
So I want to, I think this is well worth addressing because it happens, and some people get pretty fired up over how to handle this on the GM side. Um, we've all had. Have you ever had a player rage quit? Like an adult player suddenly turn into a 10-year-old and flip out?
Uh, I mean, no, not like
Oh, I have.
that. Um, no, I think the reason I wanted to talk about it is because there was a couple of, because both from an in-game point of view, but also from a system design. Because one of the things we've
Yeah,
talked about in system design is where do you set the success rate for success and failure?
yeah,
Um, and we talked about how like we don't like certain systems because, it's too easy or it's too hard. But I think that where it popped into my head the most was having run these sessions. So I've had three separate times I've run 1 hour sessions for, trying to get the age right, 15-year-olds at school who are like, so a year out of coming into what we call sixth form. So they finished what we have as GCSEs and they go into the last 2 years. Well, they go into another 2 years of secondary school. And we're showing like, look, we do a D&D club. Here's a taster. And in some of those sessions, it was the people failing things where they failed and then I can turn it into something which was amusing. So and that made me think, oh, that's yeah, having failure is good because that failure can be bad in role playing games,
sure.
but also sometimes failing like moves the story forward. And so it got me thinking about actually this is a good thing to talk about, both from a system design point of view, but also as like a GM point of view. What do you
Yeah.
do when people
Like
fail?
the
And
story, call it like game management perspective.
yes,
Which one would you like to tackle first? Because I think you bring up some really great points that, especially for GMs listening, this is going to be, I think, will be useful. Would you want to look at the system side, or do you want to look at the GM management of the story and the table side?
let's do the GM management
Yeah,
side because I think that's easy to get my head. And also then if we overrun, we can go, all right, we'll push doing failure because really failure in systems is almost a different thing. It's, how often do you want players to fail or how are you going to deal with failure from a rules point of view? We may have time and we may not. And if we don't, that's our next episode. So we're sorted. So yeah, let's do it from a GM point of view. Um, I think I think from a GM point of view, one thing that is very telling, and I mentioned this in our review of Star Trek Second Edition, which should have come out by
yeah,
now, that it does specifically say in there only roll. I don't know the word of it, but generally the word will be along the lines of only roll where there is like a chance of failure or failure is meaningful. So essentially, don't bother rolling where it's something either so mundane or so basic, or the players could just put enough time and effort into it
yeah.
that they're going to succeed.
There's
Don't
there's
bother.
no pressure that would get in
Yes.
the way of, yeah, you're going to drive across town.
And so straight away, that's where we actually see an example of failure being bad. In those situations, there will 100% be GMs, and I'll have been one of them because back when I first role played, in the ancients, the 80s, there wasn't GM guidance like that. It was, if players are going to do something, I think maybe there was, I can't remember, so long ago. It may have been back then, you just hand waved things left, right, and center. But, if players want to do something, you potentially make them roll. There are definitely times where you can make a player roll for something so mundane that then they fail and it stops the game.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'm kind of thinking things like perception and investigation things where, and this is why, like you've talked in your game about having, investigation working different. And you've talked in the past about gumshoe investigation working different. Because in anything like that, where the players need to find something, making them roll for that, making them roll for something they're going to find, and then they fail it. It's that irritating thing of, I guess it doesn't work with real life. Like, there's something in the room. If someone turns over the room and spends an hour doing it, they're going to find it. So why are we rolling? Oh, actually, in that case, maybe rolling is how quickly they find it, and maybe there's a time pressure. But I can just imagine a bad GM having a situation like that. That there's a room and there's something in there. The players say, "We want to look around." Okay, you look around. Everyone rolls badly, and the GM goes, "You find nothing." And he's just like,
Yeah,
"That's
here's where it's hard because you remember that we are not we are not simulating real life.
Yes.
Okay. We're not simulating real life where failure happens, unfortunately. And we're not. We are ultimately, we are telling stories. We're playing with things that aren't real. And depending on the people involved, depending on the genre or the game or the type of story, there will be varying degrees of simulationism, believability, plausibility as part of the game. You know, and uh, and so you can't be so rigid and pedantic as a GM to be like, well, you failed. Well, then you
Yeah.
don't have a freaking story. Like if in at the beginning of Star Wars Episode 4, if the droids don't get off the freaking ship with the plans, there's no Star Wars movie. Like that.
Yes.
Well, sorry, that's what happened. That's a stupid excuse. So you're right that as a GM, you've got to decide what is essential to move the story forward and to keep things interesting and enjoyable for the people at the table, yourself included.
Yeah.
And so I like the idea of, you need to find, if clue X is the thing that has to be found to move the story forward. Well, if you're going to roll for it, if it really does make sense to roll for it, or maybe there's something in the system where, for example, in a 2d20 system, there are times when players, you want to roll at least regularly because you want to generate momentum. So you don't want to not roll. But I like your idea of, okay, yeah, you're gonna find it, but maybe it takes a long time, or
Yeah.
maybe it draws unwanted attention,
Yes.
or you use up some resource, not time necessarily, that you didn't want to use up so much of, but because it took a long time or whatever. That there are consequences other than failure that can make the story interesting, but the story still moves forward. And I think some GMs get stuck on this, and this is where I see, and they are the stupidest arguments. Oh my gosh. Well, I think pretty much every argument on X is stupid. Like, I think the moment you start having an argument on X, you are having a stupid argument. But people are like, no, you take what the dice say and that's it. And if you're not doing it that way, you're wrong. Like, oh my gosh. If the story goes nowhere, like the idea that failure, binary success or failure, is the only consequence. Failure is the only consequence. There are plenty of other things that you can throw on as a GM to make a situation interesting, but they still get the information
Yeah.
that they need to
I
move
think
the story forward.
I think as a GM, we'll put combat to one side for me. We can come back to combat.
Yeah.
Outside of combat, generally, if players are doing something, they're doing something because it is going to further the story. They are talking to a character to get information. They're looking for something. They're sneaking past a guard. They're breaking out of a locked cell. They're breaking into a locked building. They're hacking it. Whatever they're doing, they are doing that to further the narrative or the mission to get them to an end point. That's what most roles are going to be. If you fail this, the thing that you need to do doesn't happen. Now, I think, yeah, what you need to do understand as a GM is that some of those things, it's okay that if they fail, they fail. As long as there's another route. Okay, well, there's three options. If you fail option A and B, there's an option C. Now, maybe one of those options is harder, or maybe one of those options actually is one that's not obvious. And then maybe the player, you have to go, but you do occasionally have these things where the player, if you keep going, well, you failed, you need a backup. And so the reason I thought about this initially is I said I did ran these sessions for these 15-year-olds. And in the first session, they were trying to break out of this jail. And the first guy to do it fluffed his roll. And so I had him he ran at the wall to break open the gate. And I had him miss the gate and he hit the wall and he fell over and he took a point of damage. And everyone laughed. It was hilariously funny. And that was what actually failure can be a good thing, because in that case, failure was comical. It was amusing. Later on, they were trying to cross this river. Some of the players failed. They fall in the river. Other players got to rescue them. That was a good point. But then it can also go wrong if you apply those same rules. So I ran the same adventure 2 sessions later. The players failed to force the door. They tried to lockpick it. They failed to lockpick the door. They tried to get the guard to come nearby so they could steal his keys. They failed that. And I reached a point wow, they have failed literally everything I've set up for them to get out of the room. And so, but then you have to pivot into another thing, right? Well, the guard, it was always going to be this fire, and the guard is going to, and there's an escape. But in the first two times I ran it, the secret door was outside of the prison cell, but it's still inside the prison. This time they hadn't managed to get out of the cell, so I just changed it. The escape stairs, because there was a fire or a riot or whatever in the rest of the hotel, in the hotel prison, was stupidly in their cell. Now that made no sense, but it got them out of the cell because otherwise, otherwise everything's gone horribly
Yeah.
wrong. It's that kind of thing. You have to, you definitely cannot have a situation where bad rolls stops the story. Now, if it's something you're making up as you're going along, you're just winging it, then that's fine because you can always wing another
Yeah.
situation. If it's something you've planned in advance, you have to, you cannot have a whole, set of encounters. Like if we take doing a heist, you're breaking into a building to steal something. Ideally, at some point, there either have to be enough different ways the players will succeed at one point, or something that doesn't require on good dice rolls. Like worst case scenario, they just brute force their way in through the front door, guns blazing, because then at least you're into combat, and usually the players might overcome. So both from a planning and on a thing. Sometimes you got on a GM, you got to think on your feet.
Oh yeah, all the time.
But I think definitely, I don't think what you should be doing. So that's on the one thing. If you're going to be that hardcore of you failed, so that's it, you failed. But definitely there are other times being right. Well, actually, having the players fail, like, oh, it doesn't happen. You kind of mentioned this already. Oh, we haven't mentioned already. Sometimes you can have what some games would now call failing forward.
Yeah.
Well, okay,
That's a popular term now.
yeah, you didn't, you didn't pass it the way you wanted to. Okay, you try to pick the lock, the player fails the roll. Oh God, I need them to get into this building. All right, and you kind of mentioned it earlier, right? You do pick the lock, but you take long enough about it and you're noisy enough that a
Yeah.
guard comes.
Or
So you
something
you
like
have failed.
this actually happened recently in a game that I was running. It's like, okay, you pick the locks, but you break your, you broke one of your lock picks.
Yeah.
Something like that. You can, I actually am, if you're going to, if you're running a game wherein information finding, I don't mean maybe that's not the crux of the game, but if that plays a pivotal, if there's a pivot point based around the characters and the players gaining some information, and that information is the key to unlock forward motion in the story, in the plot, you have to get that to them. And you can't
Yeah.
be a peckerhead about die rolling. You just can't be. If you're going to create something, if you're going to create an adventure that has that. Now, combat's a little different. Combat's a different animal. I don't know if you want to move to that yet.
We'll get to combat, but I think there's a few more things we can say about this kind of thing.
Okay.
I think one thing that's definitely worth considering is kind of having an idea in your head as a GM of what is success and what is failure. Because it shouldn't be binary. And I think a lot of sometimes it's old school, and sometimes because it's the way the rules presented. There is you roll the things, you do it, and that's usually straightforward. You rolled well, you succeeded, you've done it, yay, brilliant. And then you have something like 2d20 where actually, well, you have degrees of success. You might succeed so well that you get this momentum. Or you're talking to someone, you get extra information. That's built into the system. That isn't built into other systems. So a lot of systems, say D&D, seem binary. As a GM, really, what you went right? What does failure mean? Because failure could mean very, very. It just doesn't happen. But it could also be like you said. It could use some resources. It could like you break your equipment. It could be you're talking to someone, you're trying to negotiate, and right, you fail. Well, you don't fail, but they want more money, or they want you to give something to them before they'll tell you the information. Or it could be time. If it's a time sensitive game, then right, you do pick the lock, you do get the information. It just takes longer,
And
and
now
I
you
think
have to
that's
rush in your
yes, and
next
that's
set of
yeah,
actions.
and I think that's a way that GMs need to think about failure. Failure shouldn't be binary. It should be right. If they succeed, this is what happens. But if they fail, what different things could it
I
be
think a
rather than
simple
just it
way,
doesn't happen?
I like this. I like this idea. And I think a simple way to remember this is it's when it comes to essential information gathering, okay, and that's what we're talking about here. It's not an issue of success or failure. It's an issue of how much does it take to get what you need?
Yeah. What
What
does it
is the
cost?
cost of getting that information? Is it in time? Is it in resources? Is it in money? Is it in some other kind of opportunity for action given up? GMs don't think of it as, well, you failed, screw you. Sorry, you rolled a 7. Out of
Yeah.
luck. And then what are you going to sit there and stare at each other and the game goes nowhere? That's dumb. What does it cost you? What does it
Yes.
cost the characters to move the thing forward? And if they roll really well, if it's that kind of a system, then it costs them very little. If it's a
Yes.
system wherein you can roll, call it like parallel negative or parallel positive effects. Maybe if they roll parallel positive effects, then it takes them even less time. Like
Yeah.
in 2d20, you can spend momentum on an extended task to take less time to do the thing. So if they roll exceptionally well, then they got there even faster. They used up fewer resources or whatever. I think that's a better way to look at it. Not success or failure, is how much did it cost you
Yes.
in figurative terms to succeed?
Yeah. So I think covered that pretty well.
I
So I
think we
think then
did.
when you move
Brilliant.
into combat, this is where I get really pissed off. This is one of the reasons I don't like D&D, and this is one. See, I brought this up with you a couple of weeks ago as an idea for a system, and you poo-pooed it straight away. It's the idea that in combat, and you need to make that you as a player, you could do a system where you always hit, or mostly you hit, and you're rolling to see how well you hit. But then maybe that would be reduced by damage. It doesn't work with the D&D thing where you've got armor class. Because the most annoying, I think I've had this in D&D, I've had it in Savage Worlds.
Plenty of games.
Yeah, where you can just have a bad day and you keep missing. Now,
Yep.
as a player in combat, every time you miss in combat, it feels nothing happened.
Right. You
No,
just spent, it
yeah.
came to you and you're like, nothing. I hate
Now,
that.
yeah, now that's kind of one reason actually something like Powered by the Apocalypse actually does a better job, because you roll, if you
You're on
hit,
thin ice
you
here.
I know, I'm just saying this as an example. I mean, there's things like I'm going to bring up as an example why this doesn't work versus, say, Blades in the Dark, which is similar and does a much better thing. Something like Power by the Apocalypse, if you roll to attack, well, you're saying I'm going to attack this guy. Generally, how it would work is you roll really well, you get to attack them. You roll middling, you both hit each other, and if you roll badly, they hit you. But there's never nothing happened. So something always happened. Now that works because you're not having to roll for you attacking them and them attacking you. It's really one roll. It's what do you want to do, and so it's set up better. One of the problems with D&D is that you can have situations where, this isn't just D&D, I'm just using it as an example.
Sure.
You go to attack a monster and hit. Now, whether that monster has lots of armor or is really quick or is really tough, whatever, if you miss its AC, you don't know. Now, as the GM, you can narrate, oh, well, you only just missed it, so you hit its armor and it bounces off, or
Yeah.
it's really tough, so it bounced off its tough hide, or
Sure.
it dodged it because it's got really high AC, but it's from its dexterity. But it doesn't matter to the play. You missed. So it feels
Yep.
like you wasted your turn. So I have seen a couple of games now that are moving more towards this idea of on your turn, when you choose to attack something, you do some damage. What you're doing is it a relatively insignificant amount of damage or a massive amount? But actually, that does relate to the system, because in D and
Yeah, it
D,
does.
if you miss your
That's
turn,
it.
not only is your turn wasted, you can always think of that there's basically this massive health pool on the bad guys. You have to keep chipping away through that, and every time you miss, that health pool isn't chipped away at.
Yeah.
So you screwed it up.
And
Now, in something like
you
two,
may have used up a resource. Like if you're a
you use your
spellcaster
action. Your,
and you have to
yes,
roll, let's say it's a spell that you have to roll to hit and you just flat out miss. Okay, I'm going to say that I think that on the information gathering or the social interaction side of things, we didn't address that all when we talked about GM management. And I think that's a whole nother issue because of the interpersonal and the more of the, anyway, I don't want to get into that. We should treat that as a separate topic along with this. And if we have time, we'll hit it. If not, we'll hit it in the future.
oh,
But
that isn't the idea.
I think that when you move to combat, you move into an area where the system is far more important than just the GM's management of the
Yes,
system. Because combat is where things typically, in most games, is governed very far more precisely. That's where in most of these games, most of the rules are. That's
yeah,
so that's where success. You're absolutely right. I mean, frankly, D&D and its tree of games, Pathfinder, Castles and Crusades, you name it. Those games handle failure in combat really poorly.
Yes.
Now, look, you watch movies and you see, like, I mean, well, I don't know if you remember this, but do you remember how long a combat round was in first edition D&D?
Wasn't it 60 seconds at
It was
one
a
point,
minute.
and now it's come,
It was a
yeah, and now it's
minute.
come down to 6 seconds.
It
Yeah,
was
I
a
thought
minute, and the idea was that this was like this this back and forth and back
yeah,
and forth, back, and so it wasn't one roll is one swing.
yes,
Okay, I think in some ways that actually handles things a little better than now this idea of one die roll is one swing and then you miss
get
and
that.
nothing happens. And that's boring. You're absolutely right. Now, failure happens sometimes, and not every swing is gonna hit. And if the goofy thing about everybody hits and we're just gonna roll damage. What if you roll crappy damage or it doesn't overcome the thing's armor? That's like this stupid. A number of years ago in American education, which is just governed by like 4 to 5 year stupid fads, there was this push years ago, well, you shouldn't use red pens to mark up kids' papers because they'll see the red ink and they'll feel really badly. That's moronic. They said use
We do it.
purple ink. I was like,
No,
yeah,
we
and in
do that.
10 years kids will get they'll quiver over purple ink. What that's stupid.
No, we
So
switched into that. Yeah,
all
green
you're
ink for
doing
marking, red for
all you're
pupils.
doing if you say, listen, everybody hits, but then the question is, do you defeat the
Yeah,
armor? That's the same thing. It's,
it is,
are
but
you
it's
successful in
yeah,
moving toward, are you successful in chipping away at the stone to reach your goal of winning that combat? If the answer is only yes or only no, that over the long term gets boring. And I think
it
that's the
does.
issue with combat.
But I think in something like D&D, I think that then this, because I'll come to the difference in 2D20, why it's okay to miss. In something like D&D, where bad guys have huge health pools, having to roll to hit and then having to roll for damage is a bad idea. Simply because you can roll and hit, and then you roll and do very little damage. What is the hit roll doing? And also, they're going to hit you. So either something like that wants to get rid of the hit roll completely and just have you roll damage, and either you do really good damage or you do a little bit, and then it could be negated by armors. You've done nothing, but at least a lot of the time you're feeling like you're doing something.
Yeah.
Because the trouble with D&D is you are frequently doing. If you miss, you do nothing,
Yeah.
nothing at all.
And
Now,
you're
at
right,
least
with growing hit point pools and over time it doesn't seem like damage keeps up.
yes. Now there are
That is
systems to get
that's a
around.
real problem.
Yeah. So like 13th Age, for example, got around that by having a miss thing. If
Yeah.
you missed your hit roll, you did damage equal to your level, I think,
Yeah.
which only went to 10. But that meant that even if you missed, you still did some chip damage,
Yeah.
which is a good now. So that's the other thing. You can have, if you miss, you do chip damage. Right. You just do your strength bonus and you don't roll something. Because what you don't want in D&D is having to roll to hit and I think you should have something else on top of that.
Yeah.
And then also the bad guys hit you. Now in 2D20, that is different because in something like 2D20, you can one-shot a bad guy. So I think that's where there's a massive difference in the failure and how you go. And we are kind of moving into a system thing now.
Oh yeah.
In something like 2D20, you can one-shot a bad guy if you roll really, really well,
Yeah.
or whether it's because your friends have set it up, or they're assisting you, or you burn a whole stack of momentum. It is entirely possible in one hit to take out a lot of bad guys. One of the issues I had with Conan is Conan didn't have those rules for like bad guys with like higher health. And now the acting Cthulhu does. Like you cannot one-shot Cthulhu. Just it's
Yeah,
not
no.
possible. But in Conan, you could one shot, or could like my guy Scott and Brian did it. We were fighting like some big scary beastie that I'd found in the book, and they literally just rolled well enough that it's like,
Well,
right,
and the
oh,
one
I've done
good
this
thing
many wounds in one go.
the one good thing from D&D 4th edition were minions.
Mm.
That you could one shot multiple or at least get wade through.
Yes.
So one, this whole issue of how do we deal with failure? It's harder to deal with, and it is far more system and rules dependent in combat. And different
Yes.
games deal with it differently. And there are different, call it trends or quasi movements in gaming in general that address this. I remember that thing about 13th Age. There was the other thing too, was it called the escalation die?
Yeah, yeah.
So that as combat progressed, everybody got bonuses. Everybody at the table got
Putting the
bonuses to
bad
hit.
guys.
So
Yeah.
there was a mechanical thumb on the scale in 13th Age to bring about a quick end to combat. And that was meant to address the grind of
Yes.
long combats. That doesn't necessarily address failure
No.
in combat. I think, hmm, yeah, I think it's complicated. It's harder because you as GM either have to house rule things if the game you're playing doesn't allow for or provide for these sorts of things, or you've got to find a game that offers these
I
other bits and bobs that let's just say, I mean, your more traditional systems do not. More traditional systems being those where in combat you hit or you miss,
I mean,
and
it's
then you
funny
do
because
some amount of damage.
we kind of hinted on it earlier that a lot of systems do say only roll when it's meaningful and important, and failure could or couldn't be interesting, that kind of thing. And yet, when we get into combat, it's
It's
now
all
strictly
meaningful.
defined. It's all, it's
Yeah,
you can't have that. We've already hit this idea that outside of combat, success is success, but failure shouldn't be failure. Failure should be what does it cost you? That's actually what combat should be. Combat really, if you break it down, is an extended task. There is a bunch of bad guys and there is a bunch of good, there's a party. And the party presumably needs to defeat the bad guys. It doesn't have to be by killing them. It could be by making them run away.
right.
But that's how you need to win. Now, one thing, how often nowadays do we make bad guys run? Back in the day, you
Yeah,
had morale systems, so bad guys would run. One or
yeah,
two guys would drop, the rest would run.
yeah. I see,
That seems
barely
to have
anybody does that anymore. It
it's
seems like.
gone. And actually, I hardly ever do that as a player because sometimes as a GM, you think, oh, well, it's making it too easy for the players. But, you know, again, combat encounter should be similar to a non-combat account. What is the cost? Is it you've run out of healing potions? Is it your resources? Again, is it time? Are those guards just stopping you getting to the main bad guy before they can do their ritual that summons the big beastie? Because
Yeah,
then that's a time resource. That one should be most combats, if they're just there for no reason, for start to get rid of them. But if they're there for reason, it should be what is it going to cost you? Is it going to cost you
yeah.
resource or time or something else? Or is that combat meant to be there to be enjoyed because it's going to be a fun, cool thing?
I mean,
In which
exciting.
case,
Yeah,
yeah, and it's awkward. I mean, we can almost do a whole nother. I think on terms of system things where you set the rules for this, but I definitely think combat and failure are the whereas we've got these things in these books which now clearly says this is how you should deal with failure out of combat. In combat, we don't have that.
no.
Still, we've seen games like 13th Age try to have a go at it, and I've seen other systems try to have a go at it. D&D still is, if you
No.
miss, if you roll and you miss, you miss.
The funny thing about D&D is that when you
And
strip away all the, frankly, when you strip away all the kitchen sink BS that they've added to it, like setting wise and how, all anyway, when you strip away all that, to be perfectly honest, it's a really blah system.
it is, yeah.
And it's been a blah system for a long time. There is not a lot of texture to it. It is
No.
not particularly creative. It is most certainly not innovative in any way, shape, or form. It is actually little c conservative and really boring.
Actually, there's an exception to that, and it's what the internet has now realized in its internet wisdom. When it came to combat, fourth edition did it really well. The trouble
Fourth
with
edition
fourth,
is a terrible role playing game, but for skirmish
yes,
combat, you're right.
and that's the trouble is that D&D has now gone back to back to an older version, a much older version of what its combat was like, almost back to second edition, and hasn't added anything interesting. You
No.
don't get to do cool stuff in fifth edition combat. You're still throwing fireballs and lightning
Yep.
bolts. Rangers are still dual wielding. And in fact, fighters don't even get to do stuff. They used to get to do cool things. Battle master fighters get to do cool stuff.
But yeah. So
But
so back to the zooming out, back to the bigger topic of failure. Um, I think what's hard, what if you want to handle it well at the table, you have to, as GM, you have to remember that there are certain types of failure that you can use to make the story more interesting,
yeah,
and that's on you. And then it's also a bit on your players to not get butt hurt when, because you know how sometimes players are, they come up with what they think is a great idea and then it doesn't work out and then they get whiny.
yeah,
So your players just have to not be children. but you as GM have to look for those opportunities to take mechanical failure and make something interesting out of it. In combat, that I think is harder than in because of the rules than it is in more, call it narrative or dramatic play. And yeah, wow. I mean, we need to think about that and solve all the problems of the world in gaming.
I definitely the idea of failure should have a cost, but that's what we mean. Failure should have a cost. Shouldn't mean necessarily failure.
Yeah.
So just we're not saying that players should never fail.
No.
We're saying, but sometimes instead of them failing what they were trying to do outright, there should be a cost. And sometimes you just have to let them fail. I mean, I was literally one popped into my head in a Savage Worlds game, which has all kinds of problems with failure in combat. Where it was at the end, it was a one shot. We were basically finished, and it was jumping. Like Brian's character was jumping from a building to the helicopter or spaceship, wherever he was jumping to, across a gap to escape. And he fluffed his roll. And I'm like, okay, Scott can roll to catch him. And Scott fluffed his roll. And it's like, well, you have just jumped from one thing to another thing, 200 feet in the air. You fall. You scream. Scott screams. Your character dies. It didn't matter. It was a one shot. It was a funny, comical ending for the end of the session. So sometimes failure can just be failure. I mean, that was a cost. His character went splat. But but again, that's in a one shot. If that had been a campaign,
that's a different animal.
No way does that character die.
I think maybe the way to look at it is, don't think of failure as being final. Failure is a setback. It is a stumbling block. It is a barrier that forces you as a player to take a different approach, but it's not a final issue. Now, this actually gives me a good idea, at least I think it's a good idea, for another episode, and that is dealing with character death.
Ooh, that is a good
That's
episode.
what we should talk about next. So, character death, but that's perhaps the ultimate form of failure. But yeah,
it depends what kind of game you're playing.
True, good point. If you're listening to this, we would love to hear, what do you do? How do you handle the mechanics and the story side of failure? What is your approach to handling players in this? So as we said at the beginning, join the Discord, drop some comments on the YouTube, connect with us in one of those places and let us know. Let's stir the pot a little bit and share some ideas. And next time we'll talk about character death.
Yep.
Because it happens. Thank you, as always, for listening to Fluff and Crunch. You can join our Discord, you can subscribe to the podcast, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, all through the links in the show notes. Thanks again. Have a great day. We look forward to talking with you.